Let me just introduce David. Since his debut collection of stories, A Quick Kiss of Redemption, David has established himself among the finest and most incisive American writers of contemporary short fiction, which we were talking about the other day. Some people have said in the Paris Review, Means has delivered exquisite local portraits of the destitute, desolate, and disconsolate in post-industrial America. A recent recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, David was born and raised in Michigan. His second collection of stories, Assorted Fire Events, earned the LA Times Book Prize for Fiction and a National Book Critics Circle Award nomination. His third book, The Secret Goldfish, received widespread critical acclaim and was shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor Prize. His fourth book, The Spot, was selected as a 2010 notable book by the New York Times and won an O. Henry Prize. His books have been translated into 8 languages, and his fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Esquire, the Best American Short Stories, and the Best American Mystery Stories, and the O. Henry Prize Stories, and numerous other publications. He lives in Nyack and teaches at Vassar College. Especially good for us today in our second presentation as part of this grant is to have David's take on soldiers coming home. So please welcome David Means.
Hey everybody, I like the microphone. Thank you for coming out. It's a nice afternoon. It's too nice to be in here, and maybe the library vibe is, I don't know, just deal with it. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes. I have to say, first of all, I don't know how many of you are in Jerry's classes. Yeah? I mean, you're really lucky to have this guy as a professor. You may not know that yet. Maybe you'll know that in a few years when you think back on your college career. Jerry is a hippie, you know. I mean, he doesn't look like one anymore, and I guess he had a birthday recently. But, you know, I met Jerry. I was too young to fight in Vietnam. I was basically your age, younger than you when Vietnam was going on. But you probably already know this. You know, war affects you even if you're not in the war. You guys are surrounded right now by the chaos. I mean, Matt Lauer, what are we going to do? You know, Matt Lauer was fired this morning, but we're surrounded by this chaos right now. And no matter what your political point of view is, if you're conservative or liberal, you're in a world right now that is in really chaotic upheaval. And there's been a lot of talk about war with Korea, you know, North Korea, a lot of loose, easy talk about having a war with another country. And I have a couple of things I want to do today. I want to talk about my book, and I want to also talk about war and about the people that come home from war. The truth is, I was so affected by the Vietnam War. It was part of my youth, and I was affected by the images, and I was affected by the guys in my neighborhood who went and came home, and they were changed, they were different, they were we didn't know what PTSD was back then. They were just fucked up, you know, when they came home. And I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Michigan, and I just absorbed all this stuff. So later, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, I always wanted to write a Vietnam novel, a novel about Vietnam. But I didn't know how to do it. And I wasn't sure why. I mean, why would I write a novel about a war that I didn't fight in? But that's the power of the imagination, and that's the power of being, creative and dreaming and thinking about the world of those who you haven't, living vicariously through other people. So I met Jerry, and Jerry helped me tremendously, giving me all of this stuff, giving me all this information, giving me books to read and things to think about. And so this book, Hystopia, would not even exist if I hadn't had the good luck of meeting Jerry. He's actually in the book. There's some interviews at the opening of the book, and I just stuck Jerry's name in there when I was writing it, and then I asked him, I said, Jerry, do you mind if I keep your name in there? He said, I don't mind. So he's in the book. But before I get to this, I want to talk just a tiny bit about what war is. I mean, you all know that war is about killing. War is about killing other people. We all know that. When I was researching this book and talking to vets and thinking about trauma and what it does to you to kill another person, one thing I discovered is that it is not natural. It is not normal. You might think it is, but it is not normal to kill another human being. It's not easy to do, and it's not something that we're equipped to do. Even though if you play video games, you think you could do it. It's actually a tremendous, it goes tremendously against human nature to kill another person. Even when you're enraged, it's not as easy as you think. There's a book, and I forget the guy's name, On Killing. It's called On Killing. It's by a guy who was a high-ranking soldier at West Point. And he studied soldiers in battle, and what he discovered is that a lot of guys don't do what they're supposed to do because they actually shoot over the head. And this is in World War II, the war that we won. They shot over the heads of other soldiers, and they just didn't do what they were supposed to do. So what I discovered, I didn't discover it, but what I came to learn was that the trauma of killing another person is something that or even worse, having one of your buddies, one of your friends killed in battle is huge. What happens in combat is that you become closer to now it's men and women, but at the time of Vietnam it was men in combat. You become so close with these guys in your unit. It's a kind of love and friendship that you just don't get anywhere else. So when one of your buddies is killed alongside you and you go into this rage that's unbelievable. And that rage is something that really, the more I studied, the more I realized that that's a huge part of the trauma and the horror of war, is seeing the friends that you make killed alongside you. But I guess one of the things I want you to think about is what happens when somebody you love is killed. I don't want you to think too much, but just think about the grief that you go through. You go through a stage of grief, and then you go through a stage of rage. If it's an accidental death, if it's a young death at an early age. There's a guy named Jonathan Shea. He's an expert on trauma, and he wrote 2 books. One is called The Iliad in Vietnam, and this one's called Achilles in Vietnam. The other one is Odysseus in Vietnam. And this book says that there's a rapid transformation of grief into rage when you're in a combat situation. And what happens with guys who come home is they haven't had a way to deal with the grief of loss. Not just killing other people, but the grief that comes from killing another person and seeing your friend killed. And they don't have a way to deal with it. And if you don't transform your pain into grief, and you don't go through a grieving process, you basically end up just having rage. I'm not sure what else I can say on the matter, except that we need, as a society, we need to be really aware of this fact that when soldiers go and fight, they're put into situations that are inhuman, and they're put into situations that create tremendous grief. I didn't mean to get so dark about it. But the thing is, I actually want to read a poem. Jerry, I don't know, has he ever told you that he's a great poet? I'm sure he hasn't. I'm going to read one poem in this book. It's called American War Poetry. I just picked it up this morning after hearing about Matt Lauer being fired. I was like, okay, I knew he was going to be fired, but, and I read this poem by Wallace Stevens. I don't know if you know Wallace Stevens, a great American poet. It's called The Death of a Soldier. Life contracts and death is expected. As in a season of autumn, a soldier falls. He does not become a 3-day personage, imposing his separation, calling for pomp. Death is absolute and without memorial. As in a season of autumn, when the wind stops, and over the heavens the clouds go, nevertheless in their direction. This poem you know, I just read it. I've never heard of it before, so you probably didn't even absorb it. I'm not a good listener. When I go to a reading, I have a trouble listening to poetry. But the poem is basically saying that death is death. It's the end. And you can wrap it in all the memorials and all the parades and all the monuments and all the banners and all the hoopla and all the bullshit that you want to wrap it in. But when you are killed, you're dead. And you're buried in Arlington Cemetery, and that's it. And I know this sounds preposterous and maybe even a little bit hyper or something, but the fact is, war is about death. It's about killing. And sometimes you have to have a war. Maybe sometimes there's a justifiable reason for having one. But we as a society should never, ever forget that death is death. It's just death. It's the end for that person. It's the terminus. It's not some fuzzy parade down Main Street. And I'm going to read Jerry's poem too, because this is a great poem and a great Vietnam poem, but it's just a great poem. It's called The Hooded Legion. There are no words here to witness why we fought, who sent us, or what we hope to gain. There is only rain as it streaks the black stone. These memories of rain that come back to us, a hooded legion reflected in a wall. Tonight we wander weaponless and cold along the shore of the Potomac like other soldiers who camped here looking out over smoldering fires into the night. What did we dream of the summer before we went away? What leaf did not go silver in the last light? What hand did not turn us aside? That poem ends with those interrogative questions, you know. There's a power in the question. What did we lose? What didn't we get to see because we went through this experience? We died. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about my book, too. I'm trying to write an essay about why I wrote this book. There's an author called Teju Cole. He wrote a book called Open City. And in this novel, there's a character who fought in the Korean War. And he says, in the novel, he explains about being in the Japanese internment camps. And he says, by the time Vietnam came around, it was a different pressure, at least for those of us who had been psychologically invested in Korea. Vietnam was the mental battle for the young, for the generation after ours. You go through that experience only once, the experience of how futile a war can be. What he's saying is, you know, you each get one war to become cynical about, to sort of understand what war is. I guess for your generation, it might be the Iraq War or the war that we're still fighting right now, but we don't hear a lot about it, so you haven't really dealt with it. But for me, like I was saying earlier, Vietnam was the war that I had to deal with because it was the only war that had really traumatized me at a young age. I don't know if that makes any sense. So this novel I wrote ended up being like an alternative history, even though I didn't really want to write an alternative history. In the book, it's actually a novel by a guy who came back from Vietnam and wrote a novel. So Hystopia is the story that he wrote when he got back. In the world that he created, John F. Kennedy was shot, but actually Oswald missed the shot, and he's still alive. And there's a drug called tryptozoid. It's a very druggy book. I like writing about drugs. And there's a drug called tryptozoid that if you take this drug and you like reenact the trauma that you went through, it enfolds it into your mind so you don't know where it is. A little like, what's that movie? Can't remember the name of it. Jim Carrey, Eternal Sunshine of the Something Mind. Do you know that movie? What is it? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. After I wrote the novel, somebody said, you know, your novel is just like that movie. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. I stole it. I couldn't remember it. So it's a little like that. You enfold the memory in your mind, and there's two ways to get the memory back. One is incredibly good sex. It's got to be like majorly good. And then the memories start coming back to you. The other is cold water immersion. If you're immersed in cold water, really cold water for long enough, the memories start coming back. Why did I create that? I have no idea. It did offer me the opportunity to write some really good sex scenes, so maybe that was it. I don't know. And I'm going to just read you a couple of different scenes to give you a taste. I'm not going to read a lot, but in this scene, there's a woman named Wendy and there's a guy named Singleton, and they're both in this thing called the Psych Corps. Their job is to enfold people and to save soldiers and to get them out of their PTSD. But they fall in love. That's against the regulations of the Corps. They're not supposed to be messing around with each other. They're also doing a lot of drugs together. Wendy's father is a World War II vet. So Wendy and Singleton's a vet from Vietnam, and they go to Wendy's house, and this is a little scene that's really about a World War II vet meeting a Vietnam vet. And they're kind of, I'm only going to read a little bit, but there's a little dynamic of two veterans meeting each other, and the World War II vet wants to tell his story, wants to share his experience. I don't know if you've ever met a World War II vet, but if you have, talk to them. Get them to talk. And Singleton doesn't really want to talk about Vietnam. I'm just going to read a little bit just to get the dynamic going. Wendy's father greeted him with a meaty handshake, saying, "Come on in. Don't listen to anything that guy has to say. Wendy told me all about you." Singleton paused at the screen door. That man, his long flaxen hair in the sunlight, this is a veteran, another vet in a wheelchair out in the yard, was popping wheelies in his yard, his arms jerking, the metal foot grills dipping up and down. I should have warned you about him. I saw him coming 100 years ago. The house had a small parlor with 2 easy chairs, a plush green couch, and a large television console on which 2 batters were up to bat, the image of one slightly on the side of the other. Singleton resisted his desire to go and fiddle with the rabbit ear antenna and followed Wendy down the hall and into the clean, well-lit kitchen where her father was preparing coffee. The old guy held a pot with his arthritically clawed hands, all pain, nothing but pain, up the arms to the tattoos smeared with age. From the start, the grunt-to-grunt tension was there, both men sensing, and maybe Wendy, too, the weight of the approaching topic. "I'm going to get us a little nip," the man said when the coffee was gone. He had a bottle of bourbon and poured 3 shot glasses tight to the rim as possible and said salute, and then drank his down before they could touch glasses. If he had been a different kind of man, he would have toasted his regiment or the Black Forest, but instead he kept it clean and simple. The old man wasn't ready yet to go into that, and instead circled around the conversation around to the Psych Corps, into the system, into the hospitals, saying, so you're each on a different case and you can't talk about it. Is that it? You're sworn not to talk about it, as I understand it, but you're allowed to speak in generalities. Most of the men I fought with came home and took the weight onto their own shoulders. Yeah, we're allowed to speak in general terms. And in theory, we're not even supposed to be together, Singleton said. In the half-light of late day, Wendy's face seemed to glow. She arched her brows, grimaced, and then smiled. Her face said, "You're an old man and can't be expected to grasp the vision behind this huge national project. Okay, maybe I'm just out of the loop on this enfolding treatment, but there's something fishy about it, and something even fishier about the fact that the administration admits that it's bogus and it's written into the creed or the credo or whatever you call it. The one that went around the house practicing for weeks when you were studying for your exams." Here the old man turned his attention fully to Singleton and, sounding much older, said, "You should have seen her studying day and night in her room." The old man opened up on the subject of war by nodding to the shelves and saying, I got an idea for this setup from looking at a galley. A buddy of mine served on a sub and got me on board and showed me around, and the one thing that I was impressed with was the fact that the galley had the finest bone white china and the best silverware. You had to spend half a year breathing shit air in a tin can and sleeping ass to ass, but at least you had good food and fine dinnerware as part of the deal. My buddy joined the Navy and I joined the Army. He went under and I went over the top. Singleton knew that the old man would use the mention of his friend in the Navy to begin his confession. And he did. The bulge, the Black Forest silence during those woozy first few weeks when the war seemed to be winding itself down, one city after another liberated. Cold, snowy days filled with the camaraderie of newly formed units. Boys fresh off the boat, struggling to understand that they were on the front edge of the great push towards the bunkered down Hitler. A few weeks in the Black Forest and the gung-ho vibe was replaced by fear. The old man paused, trying to find a way to describe the way it felt. He muttered to himself. He wanted to find a way to say it. He mentioned the snow, of course, and the fresh-faced innocence of his buddies. He talked about the wind through the pines, foxholes, plans for movement when the word came down. Just a bunch of ignorant doughboys, he said. We got in there, we dug in, and we waited. The old man's words had an offhandedness from the countless retellings. Nothing he said sounded doubtful. The story was a block of stone with the following contents. They waited in the Black Forest. Scouts were sent ahead on recon missions. Scouts spotted German reinforcements. Scouts sent information behind the lines. Brass gave a fuck. Men waited in trepidation. Germans attacked. At this point, again highly predictable, the story took a personal twist. Singleton already knew from what Wendy had said that the old man had been captured by the Germans. He was a lieutenant and had command of his unit, and he was captured. He was one of those men who had let the Germans dressed as Americans through the line. Singleton listened while Wendy, having heard the stories 100 times, no wonder she joined the Corps, tried to locate something new. There was nothing but lies, Singleton thought, when a man began talking about combat. The truth of what really happened was beyond words. In the truly mad, like that wheelchair guy out in the yard, the haze was thick and serene. Amputees had a hard time with their stories. The listener knew that the story would end with a blast of some sort, a flying sensation through the air, gaping disbelief as the man groped around to locate his missing legs. The listener was always ahead of the game when it came to a wheelchair guy. And maybe that was why unfolding didn't work on them. Maybe the story they had was trapped in the missing arms, lost like some shadow memory of feeling that came coming back again and again, mirroring the arm or the leg or the hand. What bothered Singleton as Wendy's father spoke on about his internment, the forced march to Dresden, the escape during the bombing, and the firestorm unleashed by his own troops was the old man's voice. It seemed to be saying, I'm going to go deep into the mystery and give you my war and my experience, and then I'm going to come to a full stop, maybe dab away a few tears, and you're going to say, man, sir, that's heavy, and then turn as part of the deal. You're going to have to tell me your story. You're going to have to ante up with some words, and the words must convey a sense, at least, that you're down there in the memory of some hidden truth you'll never divulge, but you'll give me the chance to find it because we went over and saw something that no one else has ever seen except for other grunts. All right, that's that one section. It's a hard book to read little pieces, but let me find another one. Okay, so Wendy and Singleton are messing around, and I wanted to write a, let me see if I can find it. I wanted to write a scene. See, the plot is too complicated to explain in a few words, but the guy in the wheelchair out in the yard in the scene I just read that they meet is Wendy's ex-boyfriend. And she had a boyfriend who went over to Vietnam and came back as an amputee. And she nursed him as long as she could. She took care of him, but then she just couldn't handle it anymore. So I'm going to read a little bit. This is right after the scene I just read. It's when Singleton realizes that she had a thing with this guy. So long, the guy in the wheelchair's nickname is the Zomboid. So long, the Zomboid was calling, his hand waving. It was clearly visible. Wendy was at the wheel, and he was too drunk to drive, and they slipped into the dark streets past the moldering houses. "We have a history," Wendy said. She turned the radio down. "That guy in the wheelchair and I have a history." "What kind of history?" "We were close when I was in high school. Then his number came up. He went over and came back, and we were even closer, and then he went back for a second tour." "How close?" Singleton said. His heart was pounding. The nut in his head began to throb, to go from an old vet, all that talk, everything that was said and that wasn't said and was said, and then to hear this, too close to talk about now, she said. If he had learned anything, it was that she made confessions when she was high. She'd hint at the fact, put something out there between them, and let it fester until she was ready to talk. He'd have to be more patient, he thought, but he couldn't resist, and he asked again, "How close were you? How close?" And as expected, she remained quiet. Her fingers curled around the wheel until she was at her place, parking. They went upstairs to the apartment and licked a tab and sat, waiting for the high to kick in. Even before she spoke, because she did finally when she was tripping, he understood that she had loved this guy in a carnal way. There was no other word, he thought. He hated that word, but it was the right one. He imagined the puppy dog teenage love, fumbling at first, but then smoothed out to a delicious first touches and then an understanding. He imagined Old Spice cologne on his shoulder blades, her nose down in there as he kissed the smooth skin behind her ear and then the nape of her neck in the back seat of a car. A young man whose draft number came up and went over and served and came back with his legs gone and his arms not working and a smart-ass new language and a new way of thinking. The new language was the biggest change, he imagined. She had had to confront the vacant look in his eyes and his physical infirmaries, but those were nothing next to the aberration of his language, the defeat that hovered between the phrases, the tight, edgy bark. Taking advantage of a temporarily clear mind the kick hadn't kicked yet, he tried to imagine it from her point of view as a young woman, seeing him off, maybe even throwing a small party on the beach with a few friends, drinking beer, somber with the fact that in the morning he would be at boot camp. A beautiful young man with corn silk hair and a smile, it was still there, that was loose and sloppy, who came back damaged. When he got back, she was finished with nursing school and working at the hospital during the day, hours and hours of serving up medication. Not drugs, she explained, we call them medication, and hanging out with other nurses and smoking in the break room and listening to them gripe, worrying because they had patients' lives in their hands. The doctors were blunt, well-tanned, always talking about their golf games. One wrong dose, one forgotten IV change, one wrong mark on the clipboard, and death would be at hand. But when her boy was discharged from the VA, he had stumps where the legs had been, still glossy and wet-looking, and she tried to nurse him, helping him change the bandages, listening to the pure post-war silence between the ranting and the raving. Then a line had appeared, and that line was a choice: to take care of him and live up to her obligations, the promises that she had made to herself and her God. She mentioned that she used to believe that her mother had been a devout Catholic. In honor of her father, she mentioned that her father had instilled in her a sense of honor and humor, or to find a way to let him go. It was easy to imagine the whole setup. His high was kicking in, but he had a chance to hear himself ask if she wanted to talk about it. "You want to talk about it?" he said. Now the ceiling was sparkling with starlight and moonlight streaming through the window, and the moonlight streaming through the window became a rhombus, changing shapes and textures, smooth marble one second. He got up and went over to touch, and then quivering and liquid the next. He went back to the bed, navigating through his high, still in control, he thought. When he looked again at the moonlight, it was smoking, steaming. He'd seen that kind of moonlight in Vietnam, maybe, maybe not. I loved him, she said, touching his shoulders, running her finger along his scar. He was a sweet boy, just a kid. And then he went and came back, and I tried for a little while to take care of him. I nursed him until I couldn't handle it. I wanted him enfolded, but of course, you know, they couldn't do that. I began to think about men and war, about stupid men and stupid wars, about getting inside somehow and fighting for change. Wow, will you look at that, he said. The moonlight was striking the floor, vibrating the floorboards, which looked a yard wide like old barn floorboards, and he heard a mooing sound and the cackle of chickens feeding, and smelled the sweet hay as he got up, got his lighter, held it, monolithic in his hands with the ego and the etchword tet, tet. On the bottom of his lighter was a stamp he had studied. He liked to imagine countless times during the rage of firefights to keep his mind steady. He could hear the kerchunk of the stamping tool machine at some factory in Pennsylvania, while Wendy, for her part, in her own high, also looked at it as he rolled it in his fingers and said, wow, wow, and studied it in her own way. For an hour, maybe even longer, they passed the Zippo back and forth. Zomboid's real name was Steve Williams. She remembered his downy lips and his smooth, hairless chest, his finger along the waistband of her jeans, a pulse between her legs, Williams rocking gently, his boy body against her girl body, his body back from Vietnam, washboard stomach, wiry arms, getting up to make her father breakfast, her hair in curlers, her father's black lunchbox on the counter, ready to go. That's a hard one to follow, I'm sure, but I think that's all I'm going to read. I just wanted to give you a little taste, and I'm going to maybe open it up to a few questions about, you can ask about writing. It doesn't have to be about this book. It doesn't have to be about war. If you're interested in creative writing, or if you even have this sort of impulse to do it, I'd like to answer questions about that too. You first.
You had a tough time picking like what you wanted to write about. How did you personally find like your writing style?
Mm-hmm.
How did you find your specific?
That's a really good question. The truth is, I'm a short story writer. I like short. You know what I mean? And I had to. The question is like, how do you find your writing style? Was that part of it? And you know, I mean, no matter what you do, even if it's not writing, you have to really pay attention to your own process. You know, you have to ask yourself, what can I do? What do I do good? What I do good? That's not even good English, is it? What do I do good? So part of the process of learning to be a writer or learning to do anything that's useful, that makes you happy, is assessing in sort of what you can do. You know, if you're really good at writing little short sentences, I mean, I'm just saying, then write short sentences until you get better at writing long ones. So a lot of like finding out how you want to do something is about being very aware of what you can do, what you're able to do at that point. And for me, I was really good at writing short stories. And I wrote a lot. And I couldn't write a novel. I kept, you know, believe me, it's sort of like if you do a short film, you know what I mean? Nobody watches short films. They want you to make a big movie. And so for years I had people saying, when's the novel? My dad used to say, where's the novel? You know, where is it? And I was just really, I like short stories. And so I stuck with that because I like the fact that when you go to a bar or you're hanging out with your friends, you don't tell novels, you know? You don't go, hey, you want to hear a novel? No, you tell stories. You know, you wouldn't believe what happened to me. I was driving past college and, you know, this guy jumped out in the road, he had nothing on, I freaked out, I drove, you know. Like, you like to tell stories and they have a beginning and an end. And for me, that's the way I thought. I'm jumping all over the place here. But I had to spend the time it took to get good enough to try to write a novel that I could put my name on and feel proud of. That didn't completely answer your question, but, and you had a question too? Yeah, I think, you know, when you're researching something that you don't have to research, like when a professor doesn't say write a paper about rocks or whatever you guys write about. Yeah, for me, I just follow whatever I'm interested in, and I didn't like do a ton. I did research. Jerry gave me a bunch of books. I watched a lot of YouTube videos of Vietnam. I talked to people that had been there. I talked to World War II vets. But I didn't, research is horrible, you got to admit, right? Nobody wants to do research. You have to do it in a way that makes you happy, and I just did it my way. I did it like hours of watching things and randomly following one thing to another. And I really believe if you're writing fiction, you should just write. Do the research after you do it. Like if you don't know what a doctor's life is like, make it up. You know, if you don't know like what kind of medication the IV drip had, don't worry about it till later. Go back and research after you've created the story. That's the way I work. You know, it's different for everybody too. That's the other thing they don't tell you in college. Everybody's different. So there's no one answer on how to do anything. You know, you can learn certain things in college, but the big answers come later, really. Don't you think, Jerry?
I think the thing that David's saying, and I think about the Singleton character in the novel, is everybody has his or her own war, so
Yeah.
you can't kind of take that away from that person. Like he's a World War II vet in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I also didn't, like, I made the book an alternative history. Like, that way, nobody can blame me if I've got the historical facts wrong. John F. Kennedy wasn't even shot. Like, Oswald missed him, he's still alive. Nobody could say, you got it all wrong, which is what you don't want to hear. You don't want to hear somebody say, you got it all wrong, you didn't, you know. You just can't worry about that stuff. But how about another question?
I was too young for World War II, but I wonder all the time why the military of this country takes so long to realize, as an example, in World War I, PSD was called shell shock.
Right.
In World War II, it was called battle fatigue.
Yeah.
Finally, we're being forced to understand that PSD is a very, very serious, complex situation.
Yeah.
And we still don't treat it the right way. And I wonder why the military don't see that and try and correct that.
Yeah, the military right now is really trying to address PTSD. Like when you're in the field and you're in battle and somebody's killed, they have a ceremony now and they try to, they're actually much more aware of it than they used to be. But the truth is, like PTSD, the important thing that you guys should know is that you don't have to fight in a war to have it. You can get it a lot of different ways. And I grew up in a very chaotic family with a lot of like anger and violence and stuff. And my sister, who never got any kind of help, my sister called and said, you know, I remember one time I did go see a shrink, and the shrink told me I probably have PTSD. And so when I was writing this, I realized I was like, gee, I think I might even, I don't think I have PTSD, but I didn't write about PTSD for no reason. But I think it's because the culture is starting to recognize that it is a real thing. It took psychologists and therapists and writers and thinkers to really understand what it was. And I think Vietnam was a different kind of war. In Vietnam, you would, like, let's say this morning you get up, you go to the airport, and in 12 hours you're in Vietnam, you're in war. In World War II, you had to get on a boat. It took days. You had weeks to learn the situation. You were with these troops and you were going to war. The situation now is that guys go over there to, and women go to Afghanistan like they're on like they're literally over there in a day, and then when they're done with their fighting, they're literally home in another day. with no process to go through decompression and to go through steps to get you used to the real world. You all know what it's like to go like on vacation or something, and then you come back to Rockland County or wherever we are here, and you're like, well, everything looks a little different, and you're like, why am I back here? I wish I was back in Miami right now. And so that they're just starting to, like, I think it's mainly the culture is starting to understand this stuff. But on the other side of the coin, the Army doesn't really want you to think too much about it. They want you to get on the plane, join up the Army, join the Marines. You know, those ads are really enticing. And you get over there, and they want it to be a video game. But I have a lot of friends who are, and this book is also about the Iraq War. There's a lot of allusions to the Iraq situation, and I have friends who are Iraqi veterans, you know, and they go, I don't think any of them weren't really messed up, PTSD, you know, didn't come back with some kind of PTSD. A lot of the guys go back. What they do is they come back, and then they just go back on another tour of duty. That's a way to get away from, to go back. You know, you don't want to leave your buddies behind in battle, so they just go back. In Vietnam, you could only, I guess you could re-enlist for a couple of tours.
You can re-enlist for a Camaro.
Yeah.
They give you a Camaro.
A
But,
Camaro?
you know, if you have people, our shoot is supposed to be here for the PTSD research project, which I didn't get the printout, but if you do have anybody that you know who has PTSD, the program at Columbia is excellent. I have the number of the contact. So there should be a sheet later in the gallery. It's a non-VA associated program, and it's free and goes for 14 weeks. So it is a different program. It's a research program. So if you know somebody who's come back from Iraq, Afghanistan, and is under a certain criteria, they'll do a phone interview, and then you don't have to go in person. It's interesting. We've been talking about this, I think, because we've been reading These Heroic Happy Gadgets, a few people from that class here. We've been talking about why guys want to go back. But I think at the time in Vietnam, they offered you a Camaro and 6 months, or 30 days, 30 days free leave for a 6-month ship over. So, I mean, they had a Camaro in your driveway when you came home, if you came home. What they found, though, with those guys that took 30 days in Paris, or wherever you wanted to go, is they didn't do really well when they came back. But it was an enticement program to get somebody to ship over. So, would you do it, you know, for a car? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the nurse spoke about this now, saying, I think somebody remembers that talk. I don't know if you did. Some people remember. She said it was really horrible. They could do wasn't it a 6-month deployment or something, and then go back again? Because you don't have any, much worse than doing 13 months. I thought she said it very well. She said it better than I'm saying. She said not only, what did she say? Cruel and unusual punishment to go back, do 6, and then go back for another 6 after coming home. So.
I mean, the thing about PTSD is that it's like, because reading about it, I learned that it's like having a broken leg or something. You know, it's an injury. It's a moral, mental injury. It's like, but you can't see it. So it's hard for people to really believe it, sort of, and believe in it because you can't see it. But if you think of it as just an injured person coming home with an injury, and that's, you know, then it starts to click into a different place. You know.
Does anybody have a grandfather? Probably grandfather, right, from Vietnam veteran? Yes. You know what I think you should do, though, is try to ease into that conversation with that person. It's a very interesting one to ease into. Like to try to ease into a conversation with a grandfather, or somebody in your family, or an uncle who might, or a great uncle who might have been in combat, who doesn't want to talk about it, or has some issues, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what I'm saying about this program. It's a very interesting program. And you should try, you know, try to take one of the little tabs. Later there's a little tab with a phone number on it. It's got a picture on the front of it of a guy in an outfit from Afghanistan or something. And you know, supposed to have the printed already, or color. You'll see the brochures. And you can just suggest it to somebody. Because it's an interesting thing to try to do to get somebody to kind of confront the fact that it's maybe been, I don't know how many years. I think for me it was 50 years before I'd spoken to any doctors. I was telling some people. So that was my first time in May last year when I finally went in for treatment. It was just a research study. was not affiliated with the VA. And so I did exactly what David did with the doctor. After I went home, I wrote the doctor an email saying, oh, I remembered all these stories. And he said, you don't have to tell us any stories. We already know what your problem is. But they were, just by doing an interview. But I felt I had to tell them, as David said, you have to say you got to tell a confessional story or tell somebody about some incident. And the doctor said, you don't need to tell us about anything. You can tell them two things you get in your intake, why and what you have, what the problem is. So they can analyze you and say, you have PTSD. It was a good program. So I'm saying it's trying to talk to somebody in your family who doesn't want to talk about it is a great example. If somebody doesn't want to talk about it, exactly like the telling you stories.
And it does apply to people if you had a violent father or mother or whatever, you grew up in violence. You could be, we all know people like that are enraged. They don't know where their rage is coming from. They're angry in a way that's violent, but they don't know where it's from. A lot of people, there was a book, Why They Kill, Richard Rhodes, a few years ago, and Richard Rhodes determined that not all, but most people that go on murder sprees or murder other people, go crazy, had some form of violence against them as a young person. Not all, but most. On a lighter note, any other questions about anything else except war? Not that I want to avoid the subject, if anybody has any other questions, yes.
How do your ideas come when you write short stories? Is it just taking day-to-day situations and how?
Yeah, that's a good question. Everybody wants to know where ideas come from. I always tell my students I don't really care about ideas, just tell a story. And that sounds, I don't mean that to be off the cuff, but I don't really, I guess sometimes I get a little fragment of something. One time, this was a long time ago, I had a friend, Irish friend in Nyack, and I don't even know why, I was just hanging out with her. My kids were little, we were having tea. I don't know what I picked up on, but I had this weird thought, this was back in the day when videotapes were the main thing, and sex tapes were big. I don't know. I just began thinking, what happens if, the person you're married, if you make, a homemade sex tape, just as a kind of I'm not talking about porn. I'm talking about, hey, let's just make a secret sex tape together, whatever. And then what happens if the person you're married to dies? What do you do with the sex tape? Do you watch it? I just was walking around Nyack thinking this thought. I guess I'm glad my brain wasn't I wasn't talking this. So I wrote a story about I used my friend as the model about her and her husband, and he dies, and then she goes out on a date. She's finally ready to start dating again, or her friends think she is, and she brings the guy home, and then she's like, let's watch a tape, and she puts the sex tape in. I don't know why, I just made that up. I just made that happen. And I think it was that was in that particular story, the idea was what happens to this intimate thing that you make if the other person dies. I guess that was the essential question. And that was the idea that got me to write the story. But, so I guess for each story, it's a different thing. Really different thing. That's why I write really different stories. They're all kind of completely different from each other. Any other questions? That's a good question, though. Is that it? Yes.
You mentioned before about we don't understand, we don't take the trouble to understand how desperate war can be and how it can affect people. As far as the Iraq War is concerned, I have three images in my head which makes the point, I think, that you're trying to make. One was, I don't know whether it's Norway and Sweden or Sweden and Norway, but when so many refugees were coming into Europe from Africa and managed to get that far, there was some kind of a rule that you couldn't do it on a bicycle. And the article went and explained that after the refugees were able to find bicycles and cross the border, there were hundreds of thousands of abandoned bicycles.
Yeah, you see, war is a political act, you know? I mean, it's not just a self-defense. The thing that we all have to keep thinking about, because North Korea just shot off another missile, you know, is we had 9/11, we had to deal with that, we had the trauma of that. That was the experience of a lot of people dying fast. But we have to really understand what war really is and what would really happen if we had, I'm jumping, but what would really happen, because I heard a friend of mine say, oh, we should just go in there and kick North Korea's ass, you know, like actually said that, and I was like, okay, whatever. I didn't even want to engage with him because I'm like, really? What war would do to us, you know, it's not just the, I mean, war isn't just like guys fighting in combat is what you're really saying. It's about, you know, massive amounts of people having to move where they live. It's about economic chaos. It's about, like, for us it would be just this unbelievable thing. We haven't experienced it. World War II was a long time ago and things were different. You know.
One of the other images, if I may, one of the other images is a story of, I don't know, it was Aleppo or one of the Syrian towns were being destroyed. And a family had been living in their basement, not to get killed, for 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah.
And at one point, they thought it was safe enough to come out of the basement, and there was a 4 or a 5-year-old boy who looked up into the sky. He had never been out on the ground. He looked up into the sky and saw birds flying, and he asked, what are they?
Right, right. I mean, you know, you got to remember, until World War II, the idea of mass murder of civilians, you know, which is what war would become now. The idea of, like, literally bombing a city into rubble wasn't really a concept until World War II. And it wasn't really kosher or appropriate to just murder civilians just to murder them. But we crossed that line a long time ago. And what I'm saying is, if we had a major war with North Korea, in the age of drones and the technology that we have now, not only would, you know, millions of innocent people be killed, obviously, but it's just totally unpredictable what would happen to us here. You just don't know. Anyway, you all know that, so I think you know it. In other words, what would happen when the drones start flying over here is what I want people to think about when they think about just casually saying we should go to war with North Korea. It's not that North Korea would send the drones over us, but maybe Russia would. We don't know. So we got to solve the problem without war if we can. That's the first stage. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off on North Korea, but war is war. And any other last little questions? You guys probably want to get out of here. I would. It's beautiful out. I hope you have a chance to get outside. Thank you. Thank you so much.